Okay, well, yeah, the electricity went out on me right there in the middle of talking, and so I know there was like a long stretch of just black screen and silence, and I figured anybody coming and watching would give up probably. So better to just start a new one and put it in the announcements, and you can catch it live, or if you don't, you can catch it on recording this week. Sorry about that. Not really anything I can do. That's the first time I ever had the power go out in the middle of a broadcast, so that was crazy. But again, this is a very short one, so it's giving me a document recovery. So even the there we go. It almost ruined my PowerPoints. I'm sure my computer is loving coming up and down with the power going off constantly. That can't be good. All right, so we've got about a half an hour left, but this was going to take about 15 probably minutes total. So we'll just get through this. I guess it's a good thing that I'd scheduled this to be a shorter one. If you're only watching this one, what you missed on the first part, which is still up, is I was talking about the paper, the extra credit a little bit, kind of looking at the schedule, the preliminary stuff we do every class. And then just as I started talking about the material for this week, boom, I lost everything. So I'm just going to cover that material in this episode. You can go back and watch the other 10 minutes if you want to see the other stuff. Okay. All right. So I was saying that the Gupta Empire covered northern and some parts of India. And this was a high point for arts, architecture, literature, and dramas, which seems to be those seem to be the areas that most early civilizations go into, right? Because they're building, there's statues and artwork and music. They're building buildings, fine, gorgeous buildings. They're writing plays and dramas and things like that. But India is also known for creating really what we think of as modern mathematics. They really were at the forefront of creating math. Now, I'm trying not to hold that against them because so much of everything we have in the modern world is because of mathematics. I just am not I'm good at the basics, but anything beyond, you start putting letters in it and parentheses and stuff, I'm sorry. Just not good. But modern math came out of there. In fact, things like algebra. It's funny because the word algebra, here's what happened. India kind of created modern math when the Europeans were using the Roman numerals. There's not a lot you can do with Roman numerals. I always say Roman numerals are great for Super Bowls and WrestleManias and World Wars, right? But you can't really do higher math functions with XVII to the, it just doesn't work. So while Europe was stumbling around with Roman numerals, India developed the numbers that we know today. But they kind of had them in India. Well, the Arabs, the Arab Caliphate, they were a very curious people. The Arab Caliphate, they were very much studying. They studied what Europeans were doing. They studied what India and China did. And so the Arab Caliphate went to India and learned all this math, and they brought it back to the Middle East. And from there, it got spread over into Europe. But the Arabs named it like the math or whatever, which is al-Jabira, right? Al dash sort of means like the. And so al-Jabira, like Al Jazeera, right? Al or Al-Qaeda. I do sort of associate algebra and Al-Qaeda. Why is that? They both terrorize me, I guess. That's it. But I'm just kidding. But al-Jabira, the Arabs called it that, and then when it came to Europe, it just got Europicized, if that's a word, into algebra. So it took a roundabout route from India to the Middle East to Europe, but it comes from India. And I always say, if you think about what our numbers are called Arabic numerals. Roman numerals are like the I, V, X, whatever. But the Arabic numbers are the 1, 2, the 3, the 5. Think about it. They're very swooshy compared to 1 and 2 and X and V. If you think about a 5 and a 7, 8. These are very swooshy numbers, and they look like Arabic writing, and there's a reason why. That's why they look that way. Classical Hinduism developed during this time with the complex social class or caste system that got more and more layers to it. And you could say, and the textbook said this, that the philosophy of classical Hinduism is live your life in accordance with your place in the scheme of things. That's a complicated sentence, but what it's really saying is know your place, know your role, be really good at that, and don't really try to be above it, because you get bad karma if you don't do your caste duty. So like if your caste was plumbing, let's just make something up, right? If your caste is plumbing, if you wanted to rise above that and be like a mechanical engineer or electrical engineer or an aerospace scientist or something, you get bad karma for that because that's not your caste. On the other hand, if you want to just be lazy and lay around and do nothing, you get bad karma from that because that's below your caste too. That's below your caste. You don't want to be above or below. You want to do good at your thing, right? In other words, live your life in accordance with your place in the scheme of things. So in a way, it's kind of admirable. It's saying know your place and be really good at it. But in another way, it's very stifling, because what if some young person has great potential to be a surgeon and save many lives, but their caste says, no, you have to clean toilets? So that potential, that promise is wasted because they never get the opportunity to do those things. And it's simple. You can see how this kind of thought process bleeds over even into modern societies. Like, think about America before the Civil Rights Movement. Young African-American people might have had the potential to be great surgeons, great astronauts, great scientists, whatever, but they too were held in their place at that time by the way society looked at them, or Native Americans, or Hispanic Americans, or Asian Americans, right? I mean, it's a case of, this is a common human failing to think that everybody's potential is dictated by the most superficial of characteristics. And so, one of the things that's really admirable about Western civilization is that in fits and starts, and never completely, we've gotten beyond the idea that your future is defined by your most superficial characteristics. And that's a wonderful thing. But that's how the classic Hindu system worked. They had specialized cults for their major gods, like Shiva, Vishnu, who is called Krishna when he's in human form, or Brahma to a certain degree, but Shiva and Vishnu are the two big ones. So in other words, you could basically just worship Shiva or worship Vishnu and ignore all the other million Hindu gods if you wanted to. Buddhism is a religion that came out of Hinduism. And it's very similar in that way to Christianity. I may have talked about this before, but think about this. You had Judaism for thousands of years, and then Jesus came along and split off in a different direction, and Christianity was, Christianity was 100% Jewish at first, and it went off with Paul and the other apostles and became its own thing. We talk about that a lot in, I think we've already talked about it in here, right? In the Roman Empire. We talk about it in History of Religion. Buddhism is the same thing. Hinduism was going along, and then Buddha came along and took it off in a different direction. And originally, Buddhism was 100% Hindu, and it kind of became its own thing. So Jesus and Buddha both are figures that took a religion in their lifetime and took it off in a different direction, and kind of inadvertently, to some degree, came up with this whole new religion. There are two major types of Buddhism. One is called Theravada. This is kind of like let me go back for a second and say, this is kind of like there's three major types of Christianity. There's Catholic, there's Protestant with all the different denominations in Protestantism, and there's Eastern Orthodox, like we saw at the Hagia Sophia with the Byzantines, right? So there's sort of like Western European Catholic, there's Northern European Protestant, and there's Eastern European Orthodox Christianity. Well, there's two major forms of Buddhism. Theravada is more like the Catholic church in Christianity, in the sense that it's the smaller, in some places, but it's the one that kind of goes back the oldest and adheres to the original understanding. They believe Buddha was just a man. You follow his teachings. The other type of Buddhism, big branch, is Mahayana, where they believe that you could sort of pray to Buddha. He's more of a God figure, right? So Theravada says Buddha was a man and you just do what he taught. Mahayana says Buddha was more like a god, and he's still in existence as a cosmic being and can actually intercede for you with the gods. And this appealed to the poor masses, right? Because if you were wealthier, you could go off and be a monk and study the teachings of Buddha because you didn't have to worry about making a living. If you're a poor person out just having to labor in the fields all day, studying the Gospels, studying the divine writings of Buddha or whatever, you're not able to do that. You may not even be literate to be able to read them, but you can pray. Anybody can pray. So the more praying to a Buddha God type, this one becomes bigger because anybody can do it. And it's the one that goes all over the world more and develops different branches, kind of like Protestantism. The whole thing, Buddhism itself, spread to the East and became unpopular back in India. In other words, think about in the Middle East. The Middle East gave birth to Christianity, but how much Christianity do you really find in the Middle East nowadays, right? It's more Jewish and Muslim. Same thing here. Buddhism came out of India, but how much Buddhism do you really find in India today? Not very much, because Hinduism became resurgent. So Buddhism had to go off to China and Japan to be really popular and successful. And there's Buddha. All right. China, meanwhile, was doing all this trading with the West, although the West didn't even always know exactly what was out there or that China was there. When Marco Polo goes to China and eventually comes back, people thought he was a liar. Nobody believed the stories that he told about it. It just seemed too impossible, too fanciful. But it was a thriving civilization. Those are the Silk Road paths. So the early Silk Road trade with Rome and other and with the Caliphate, the Islamic Caliphate and others, it was in very much isolation. China, like India, is isolated off on the other side of Asia. We talked about that before, right? It's surrounded by deserts and by great rivers and mountains and everything. It's kind of in its own world, just like India. China has always stressed order and continuity because when you've got that big of a population, you need things to be orderly and under control. When you start getting chaos and civil wars, that results in the food supply being disrupted. Maybe the rice harvest isn't harvested or not transported, or maybe it's destroyed. And next thing you know, there's starvation. When people are starving, they'll get riled up. They'll go out and protest. There'll be more wars and conflicts and warlords and all. And so China, there's a famous kind of a joke, which is a saying about China, where they say it is the greatest insult. The greatest insult in China is to say, "May you live in interesting times," because they don't want to live in interesting times when things start getting interesting. And by interesting, they mean like chaos, right? They want order. They want stability and continuity. And obviously, they have a history that goes back thousands of years. The other thing that's really famous and important about China is the bureaucracy, right? This came out of the early Confucian teachings. Confucius taught about, who to obey and to respect your elders and all that. And from that, you get this long-lasting Chinese bureaucracy. And what we mean by that are government officials that can run things, that can competently run things, right? I mean, we take for granted our government, even though we get mad at it a lot and criticize it, rightfully so often. But if you want to get, if you get a new car or you replace your car or something, or get your license plate, you have to go deal with the bureaucracy at the motor vehicle department. You want them to know what they're doing, to know which forms to use, to know how to fill it out, to know what all you need to do, right? So, these ancient civilizations didn't always have that. But China very quickly developed this bureaucracy of government officials that could handle things, could keep the government running smoothly for the people and for the rulers. And that was a big deal. And to this day, China is known for its very efficient bureaucracy made up of very educated people who are dedicated and try to do a good job. And that's fairly rare in the history of the world, you know. An elite class of administrators. We take that for granted, but that was a big development in, 3,000 years ago. The classical period in Chinese history is up till 1279. I think we talked about that time period before. And the Tang and the Sung dynasties, there's the Tang dynasty, and there's the modern border. So you can see that's Mongolia right there, actually, but there's the Chinese border and North and South Korea. So they had pretty much, this is pretty much the part of China where most people live. You could expand a little bit up here into Manchuria. This northeastern part of China is called Manchuria, which has always been a little wilder and a little separate from, this is sort of like the heartland of China. And then this is Tibet, which they would acquire later. So Manchuria, Tibet, and this is really the heartland, that coastal area. This is where you find today places like Hong Kong on the Pearl River and Shanghai and Nanking and all that. Beijing is up in the Manchurian part and Tibet out here. The Tang and Sung dynasties, the population was really growing down here in the south. This is, I think, today the most densely populated place on earth because that's where the majority or the large portion of the, today they have like 1.3 billion people in China, and this is a real large number of them exist here because that land is really good and can support that many people. The Silk Road trade I already mentioned, so they were trading with the West. They knew how to make silk. Nobody else even knew what it was. So the Europeans and Japan too. The trade also went to the East. Japan has very hot and humid summers, obviously, being on the ocean there, being an island. And so ancient and medieval Japan depended heavily on the silk trade with China because they needed that lightweight clothing that could make it livable, in the warmer parts of the year. And the Chinese didn't always like to trade with Japan. And it's interesting because by the time we get to the medieval period, to the end of the medieval period, when Europe starts going out in the world, there's a period where the Portuguese and the Spanish were like the middlemen between China and Japan. The Chinese would sell silk to the Portuguese would then resell it at a big profit to Japan. So the Silk Road trade worked in both directions and was very important to all these countries. Arts and luxury, except for women, China was a very patriarchal society, as most were back then. Some might say as most are today. I wouldn't fight you over that. And so women had sort of two paths ahead of them. If they were born into poverty, into the peasant class, then they worked in the fields, long hours, slaving away, barely better than slaves. And there were millions and millions of them and just working away, working their fingers to the bone in the rice paddies and everything. But it wasn't all that, honestly, much better if you were born into the aristocratic class. So the lowborn engaged in labor, but the highborn, the aristocratic, were virtual captives. They were basically captives of the men. The most infamous thing that they had to suffer was foot binding. I'll mention that in just a second. There's also infanticide. That continues to some degree today. The idea that having a male child, a son, would be much more valuable to a family for a variety of reasons than having a female child, which is very unfortunate, but this is true back then, how it was. And so they would leave the female child out to be taken by wolves or whatever, or try to get rid of them. In today's world, they do a lot of adoption. And you'll notice you don't see a lot of Chinese little boys being adopted in the West. It's Chinese little girls. It's great that they have a place to go, but it's unfortunate that they are not valued as much. And so that is what leads to that situation. The foot binding is where it became the fashion to have really tiny feet. And so they developed this way, like when a little girl was born, they'd start wrapping her feet up really tight. they actually would use cloth that was wet, and they'd wrap the foot up when it was wet, and then as it would dry, it would contract even more, and it would hurt so bad. But then after years of that, you couldn't unwrap your feet because then it would hurt really bad not being held together, you know. And so they were bound up and having to, you'd see the Chinese, this classical image of the Chinese women kind of like tiptoeing along, kind of this stereotypical image. And it was because that was the only way they could walk. And sometimes they would even go in with a knife and slash their tendons and then pull them even tighter and bind them up, which just, I mean, it's gross and it's horrifying, but this is what the life was like for these young women, and it's just terrible. Okay, so the Yuan dynasty, this is the Mongol dynasty. I talked about last time about how the Mongols had swept in and had conquered China, and so there is one dynasty in the Chinese past that is not a Chinese dynasty at all. It is the Mongol dynasty. This was the one led by Kublai Khan. I think I have, yeah, there he is, Kublai Khan. And this only lasted about less than 100 years, but it was when the Mongols ruled China. And of course, the Chinese couldn't wait to get rid of them, but they had to obey them while they were in charge. And Kublai Khan was the most famous, powerful ruler of China who was a Mongol. And during his reign, they moved the capital to Beijing so that they were up in the north. Because remember, I told you Beijing is up in Manchuria, and that was closer to the Mongol heartland than down in the lower area. Back then, it was. Let me quickly tell you about transliteration. Remember that Chinese names, like every Chinese word, is written in Chinese script, the anagrams, the little pictograms, and so when you put that into, say, English, you can't directly translate it because it's not in the same, it's not even using the same alphabet. There is no alphabet, it's pictograms. So you transliterate it, which means you sort of create English sounds and words and letters combinations based on what it sounds like. So what happened was the Germans went into China and they heard Chinese differently than, say, the French or the Spanish or the Portuguese. And so different translation manuals were developed by different European nations. For centuries, the one the Chinese liked was the one that worked in English, probably French, Spanish, whatever, where the capital, for example, was called Peking. And say, for example, the chairman Mao was Mao, Tsetung, Mao Zedong. Well, in the 1980s, for whatever reason, the Chinese government announced they no longer wanted to use that transliteration style. They wanted to use the German one. And of course, German is much bigger on harsh consonants, like X's and Z's and G's and Angding, Zangding, Frong, that's German. Imitating German. And so instead of being called Peking, the same name in China, using the German transliteration, is Beijing. It's the same word, just transliterated differently. And so Mao Zedong became Mao Zedong, Zedong. So it's the same names, just using different English letters and sounds to render it in English. So Marco Polo was an Italian merchant. He and his family traveled all the way out. It was very difficult for Europeans to travel out there because in the 1300s, ships still couldn't sail all the way to Asia. Not yet. They were about to. So you had to travel by land, but you had to go through the Islamic Caliphate, and they would tax you enormously or make it very difficult for Christian traders from Europe to go all the way out to the east for a number of reasons. And so Marco Polo and his family were able to get there. They got all the way out to China. They encountered Kublai Khan. And in fact, Marco Polo even stayed for a few years working as a Chinese translator and bureaucrat before eventually he packed up and moved over and came back home to Europe, whereupon the Europeans thought he was full of it. They told him, "You're making that up. You're insane." Yeah, the Europeans didn't believe it. Those bureaucrats remain there today. And well, they remained there during the Yuan dynasty. I'm sorry, I lost my sense of what I was talking about there, because the Mongols conquered China, but conquering China was one thing, ruling it on a day-to-day basis is another. Like, I mean, think about if you're one of the Khans, your favorite thing is warfare, conquer, slay, and then so when that's done, you're sitting there on your throne like, yes, I have conquered China. What do I do now? Well, Your Majesty, now you have to do things like govern and make decisions about harvesting and irrigation and taxes and all. And you're like, I don't want to do that. I want to get on my horse and kill more people. So you couldn't govern China and rule it on horseback, riding around, killing people. And so they had to keep the old Chinese bureaucracy to actually do the work while they had fun enjoying the spoils of their victory. It's the same with almost any conqueror. Conquering is one thing. Governing after you conquer it is a whole other boring issue, And there's the dynasty, the Chinese dynasty that the Mongols ruled. You can see the Mongols really did have quite a lot. They had pretty much almost all of today's China, plus Mongolia, obviously, because that's where they were from, and up into Russia. Back then, there really weren't any Russians there. And it's interesting to me, they even had North Korea. Now, I don't know why they stopped about the same place that the country's divided today. That's very interesting. But they didn't have, apparently, the South, and they didn't have Japan. And it's not for a lack of trying. The Mongols, the Yuan dynasty, sent one of the largest invasion forces in history. They left out of Korea, crossed the Straits of Tsushima. They got halfway across the straits to attack Japan, and which is interesting, by the way. Japan had tried and would try again to conquer Korea and China on several occasions, and did pretty well sometimes. Other times not so much. Several occasions, though. But this was the other way, right? This is China and the Mongols and the Koreans attacking Japan, and the ships got halfway across the straits, and a giant storm, a hurricane, basically a Pacific storm, a typhoon. Yeah, a typhoon, a divine storm. The typhoon struck and sunk the entire fleet. And when the surviving officers went back and reported to Kublai Khan, he said, "What happened? How did you fail?" And they said, "Oh, the sea monsters came up out of the ocean and attacked our ships, and great monsters came." And he's like, "You're a bunch of liars. Cut off their heads." So the Mongols didn't have a lot of patience for much of anything, and all those guys got executed. Japan would have equally limited success, but they fought back and forth over the centuries, just like Britain and France, over the centuries fought back and forth. It's, there's nobody better to attack in history, it seems, than your neighbor. So, and there's Marco Polo at the court of Kublai Khan, little tiny picture. All right, by this point, the population of China was 100 million or more, which doesn't seem like a lot today. That's less than the population of Japan by itself today. But actually, in the grand scheme of things, that's a lot when you consider that that's probably more than the entire population of Europe at that time combined. England probably had 6 million people at most. France probably had about 10 or 12 million, China had 100 million plus at that same time. So like I said, as the Chinese population has gone up, a European population has gone up, but they've always been, that gap. There's always been that proportional gap between them. But what generally has happened historically in China is that population pressure has led to famine, not enough food, which has led to unrest because people don't have food, so they get, riled up because they don't have food, which has led to them overthrowing the government. And so what we find is every 200 or 300, 400 years in Chinese history, this cycle repeats itself where the population gets too big, there's not enough food, there's unrest, there's civil war, the government gets overthrown, and you get a new dynasty that comes in and tries to fix things, and it happens over and over. There are some that argue that today we are in the Mao dynasty, the dynasty started by Chairman Mao, and that in a couple hundred years it'll get overthrown by something else. Who knows? And they justify that retroactively by saying, well, it's not that a legitimate government won't fall. So if a government falls, it must not have been worthy. It must not have been legitimate, right? You can backwards reverse engineer that as a justification. Well, no legitimate government would ever fall. So if the government falls, therefore it must have been illegitimate and needed killing. Okay. So eventually that happened to the Yuan dynasty. The Mongols were overthrown by the Ming dynasty in 1368. And that dynasty would last pretty much up until the 20th century, one of the longer lasting ones, famous for their vases, right? But their dynasty would last up until pretty much the 20th century, when you get the beginnings of a modern China that we talk about in History 102. All right. So that gets us through India and China. Like I said, I was going to start a little bit of medieval Europe maybe if we had time, but it's a good thing I had planned to do a shorter section. It just worked out that way today because we had our power outage. So hopefully everybody will see both episodes and get everything from these two. And don't forget, your papers are due. Your papers are due by midnight this coming Friday. And you should have your grades automatically up, I think, for exam 3. I think I've graded all of exam 2, so you should be pretty well set right now. But I'll go into the grade book and make sure everything looks good. And the only thing we'll have left after that second paper, again, don't forget I put the first quiz up about the Crusades. I think you only have to watch about 20 minutes of that video. I try to keep it limited for you because I know you're busy. If we were in class, I'd make it like an hour, but on here, I try to be mindful of your situation right now. So you only got to watch about 20 minutes of it, and it has some questions about the Crusades. That's worth 50 points. There'll be one more video quiz that'll come up before the final exam the next couple of weeks. I'll get that up in the next week or so. Okay, if you have any questions, send me an email or make an appointment with me. We can chat on here or whatever, however you want to do it. In a week, we're getting there. We only got 2 more weeks of two more video sessions to go. We'll be done. So, and don't forget to register for fall. I think we're going to be on campus as of now, kind of a mixed deal. All right, gang. See you later.